Underneath the pristine exterior of the Crouch family's life was a deeply unsettling truth. Caroline Crouch had moved to Greece from her native Britain, enchanted by the allure of her husband's world. Bobby's, a well-established helicopter pilot, had all the qualities a woman might hope for: charm, success, and a sense of adventure. He seemed to be the man of Caroline's dreams, the one who would sweep her off her feet and provide her with the life she had always imagined. However, as with many tales that appear perfect from the outside, the reality was far more complex. Their life, to the outside world, was an idyllic one. They often shared their moments on social media, giving the impression of a happy, thriving couple. But beneath the glossy images was a darker narrative, a side of Bobby's that Caroline would come to dread. Over time, the relationship began to shift. What was once romantic and full of promise started to feel controlling, suffocating even. Bobby's, though outwardly loving, had a side that was possessive and jealous. The subtle signs were there, but they were easy to overlook. His love for her started to feel less like care and more like ownership. He would keep a close eye on her every move, demanding to know where she was, who she was with, and what she was doing. When Caroline would try to assert her independence or simply enjoy time with friends, Bobby's would often react with anger, sometimes even accusing her of things she hadn't done. The freedom she once felt was slowly slipping away. But Caroline, like many in similar situations, had difficulty recognizing the extent of her entrapment. She hoped things would improve, believing that the love they shared could overcome the controlling behavior. She didn't want to believe that the man she had fallen in love with could turn into someone who would hurt her. As time passed, the cracks in the relationship deepened. Bobby's jealousy became more pronounced. He would check her phone, track her whereabouts, and even monitor her social media accounts. The once carefree moments they shared now felt like they were under constant surveillance. Yet, Caroline continued to hold on to the hope that things might get better, that perhaps this was just a phase. But the signs of escalation were undeniable. The relationship, once full of joy and excitement, had become a volatile mixture of love and fear. Caroline found herself trapped in a cycle of emotional manipulation, torn between the man she had once trusted and the growing realization that she was losing herself. What Caroline didn't know was that the situation was about to take a horrific turn. The woman who had once lived a life of dreams was now facing an unimaginable nightmare. As she struggled to break free from the chains of her relationship, she would soon learn that the man she loved was capable of more than she could ever have imagined. In the beginning, Caroline had believed she was living a dream. Bobby's, with his handsome looks and captivating presence, seemed to be everything she could ever want. Their initial connection was electric, a whirlwind romance that swept Caroline off her feet. As a teenager, fresh out of school and eager for adventure, she found Bobby's life fascinating. His confidence, the stories he shared about his helicopter pilot work, and the way he always seemed to know the right things to say were intoxicating. His compliments made her feel special, and for a while, it seemed like the world was theirs to conquer. The pair started their relationship with all the excitement of a young couple in love. The first few months were filled with trips to exotic locations, dinners at high-end restaurants, and nights out with friends. Caroline's social media began to fill up with pictures of her smiling alongside Bobby's, capturing moments of pure bliss. Her life appeared to be the epitome of romance. They traveled the world together, from the shores of the Mediterranean to the bustling streets of European cities. Every experience seemed to solidify their connection. Bobby's made her feel like the center of his world, and Caroline reveled in the attention. But as the months turned into years, the relationship began to reveal subtle cracks. Caroline's once carefree demeanor started to shift. It began with small things: Bobby's becoming jealous when she interacted with other men, accusing her of seeking attention from strangers. He would ask questions that seemed innocent at first, but the tone in his voice revealed something darker. "Who was that man you were talking to today, or what did you mean when you said that?" These questions were usually followed by a long silence, heavy with unspoken tension. Despite the growing unease, Caroline convinced herself that these moments were just the result of Bobby's love for her. After all, he only reacted this way because he cared. He was just protective, right? He wanted to keep her safe and away from harm. However, the more time passed, the more Bobby's behavior became controlling. The boundaries between love and ownership began to blur. It wasn't just jealousy that started to consume their relationship. Bobby's, once the charming and charismatic partner, began to show signs of anger. He would snap at Caroline over minor issues, making her feel like she was walking on eggshells. Every time she tried to express her concerns or frustrations, he would brush them off, minimizing her feelings. In moments of tension, Bobby's would often tell her that she was overreacting or being too sensitive. Caroline began to second-guess herself, wondering if maybe he was right. Maybe she was overthinking everything. At night, when the couple was alone, Caroline would retreat into her private thoughts. She started keeping a diary, a space where she could put down her feelings without fear of judgment or dismissal. The pages were filled with her emotions, joyful memories from their trips, but also moments of deep confusion and sadness. It was in these quiet moments of solitude that Caroline allowed herself to confront the reality she had been avoiding. She felt trapped. The diary entries became a cathartic release for her. Caroline wrote about the growing tension in their relationship, the way Bobby's behavior made her feel isolated. She felt like she couldn't be herself anymore. The woman she once was, the vibrant, energetic girl with endless dreams, was being suffocated by the weight of her marriage. At the same time, Caroline could not shake the hope that things would improve. She believed that the relationship was worth saving, and that if she just tried harder, if she loved Bobby's more, everything would fall into place. The uncertainty gnawed at her, but she clung to the idea that the love they shared could overcome the struggles. Bobby's, for his part, continued to show affection in his own way. He would bring her gifts, plan surprises, and make grand gestures of love, but these acts felt increasingly hollow to Caroline. She knew, deep down, that they were just distractions, ways to cover up the cracks that were forming in their relationship. No matter how much he showered her with attention, the controlling behavior and emotional manipulation remained. She couldn't escape the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. Caroline's diary entries became increasingly desperate as she wrestled with her emotions. She wrote about the confusion she felt, how she couldn't reconcile the man she loved with the man who was gradually becoming a source of pain. She wrote about the things Bobby's would say during their arguments, how he would twist her words, making her feel like the one who was at fault. She wrote about her growing fear, not just for her marriage, but for herself. Was she losing her identity? Was this the life she had envisioned for herself? Despite these difficult emotions, Caroline pushed forward. She kept her struggles hidden from the outside world, continuing to present the image of a happy wife. She tried to focus on her family, her friends, and the dreams she still had for the future. But the more she tried to hold everything together, the more difficult it became. In the quiet moments, when she was alone, she couldn't deny that her dream life was crumbling beneath her. She felt suffocated, not just by Bobby's control, but by her own inability to break free. She began questioning herself. Should she leave? Could she leave? Every time the thought crossed her mind, she quickly pushed it aside. Leaving Bobby seemed impossible. There was no clear path forward. She had nowhere else to go, and the thought of facing the world alone terrified her. Would she even be able to survive without him? The more she wrestled with these questions, the more she felt stuck. Caroline's isolation deepened. She stopped confiding in her friends, afraid that they would judge her or not understand what she was going through. She didn't want to admit to anyone that her perfect life was falling apart. Instead, she bottled everything up, maintaining the appearance of a woman who had it all. Yet inside, she was unraveling. The tension in their relationship continued to grow, each day feeling more oppressive than the last. And despite Caroline's inner turmoil, she remained committed to the idea of making it work, of finding a way to fix the broken pieces of their marriage. But in her heart, she knew that the path forward wasn't as clear as she had once believed. The dream she had clung to was fading, and the reality of her situation was starting to set in. She was trapped in a web of her own emotions, unsure how to escape the man she once loved and the life she had built with him. The night of May 11, 2021, started like any other. The cool Athens air settled over the suburban neighborhood as the moon hung high, casting a pale light on the quiet streets. Inside the house, Bobby's Anagnostopoulos and Caroline Crouch had gone to bed, their daughter, Lydia, sleeping peacefully in her crib in the next room. But by the time the night was over, their world would be shattered forever. It was just after midnight when the first sound broke the stillness, the frantic call from Bobby's. His voice, trembling with panic, was barely coherent as he reported that intruders had broken into their home. He claimed that they tied him up, robbed the family of their valuables, and, most tragically, murdered Caroline. His distress was palpable, his words chaotic as he begged for help. He told the police that the attackers had left, and he had somehow managed to free himself. He described the house as being in complete disarray, with broken furniture and signs of a violent struggle. When the authorities arrived at the scene, they were met with an eerie and haunting sight. The house was a scene of absolute devastation. The front door had been forced open, and the rooms were disordered, as though a storm had passed through. Furniture was upended, items scattered across the floor, signs of a brutal, hasty search. But what struck the officers first was the sight of the family dog lying lifeless in a corner. The poor animal had been strangled, left to die in a cold, cruel manner. But the horror didn't stop there. In the bedroom, the officers found Caroline's body. She lay motionless on the bed, her face frozen in an expression of shock and disbelief. It was as though she couldn't comprehend what had happened. The violence that had unfolded in that room was evident, but there was no sign of a struggle from her. It was as if her final moments were filled with confusion and terror, unable to understand that the man she had loved, the father of her child, was responsible for the brutality that ended her life. Caroline's lifeless body told its own story, a story that didn't match up with the initial claims of an intruder. Her death was not a random act of violence, it was calculated, deliberate. But at that moment, the investigators had only the narrative Bobby's provided: an intruder who had come in under the cover of darkness and left destruction in their wake. The police were faced with a mystery, and Bobby's was at the center of it all, his story seeming to raise more questions than answers. In the next room, Caroline and Bobby's infant daughter, Lydia, had been left untouched in her crib. The child, barely old enough to understand what had transpired, cried out in her sleep, unaware of the tragedy that had struck her family. Her cries echoed through the house, a heartbreaking sound that highlighted the innocence and helplessness of a child caught in the aftermath of such violence. There was a moment of sheer silence before the full weight of what had occurred sank in. Caroline was gone, and Lydia, a baby too young to understand, was now left without a mother, and a father who seemed too lost in his own story to fully comprehend the consequences of his actions. The scene that night painted a picture of devastation. The chaotic disorder of the house, the cruel murder of the dog, the lifeless body of Caroline, and the silence of the infant left the police with a gut-wrenching feeling that something didn't add up. But at the time, they had no reason to suspect Bobby's, no reason to question his version of events. The house had been ransacked, and there was evidence of a violent struggle just as he had described. But for those who investigated the scene, the details began to raise red flags. The crime seemed too staged, too perfect in its execution. The brutality of the act did not align with the story of a random home invasion. Why would intruders murder Caroline and leave her husband unharmed, tying him up but making no attempt to harm him? The police began to wonder if there was something more to the story than Bobby's was telling them. As the investigation unfolded, Bobby's behavior also raised questions. His actions, in the immediate aftermath of the crime, seemed odd and inconsistent. While most people would be in a state of shock, struggling to process the loss of a loved one, Bobby's was calm, almost detached. His reaction was not what one might expect from someone who had just witnessed such a horrific event. Instead of showing genuine grief, he was meticulous in recounting the details of what had happened, almost too eager to tell his side of the story. It wasn't long before the authorities began to focus their attention on Bobby's. The inconsistencies in his story began to surface. The investigators discovered that the scene of the crime had been staged. The broken furniture, the disarray of the house, the dog's strangulation, all of it pointed to a meticulously planned act. It didn't make sense for intruders to have come in, committed murder, and then left without a trace. The evidence began to point in one direction: Bobby's himself. The pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. Caroline's diary entries, which had been discovered by investigators, painted a different picture of their relationship than what Bobby's had portrayed. The entries revealed Caroline's growing sense of fear and isolation, her feelings of being trapped in a controlling marriage. They shed light on the emotional manipulation and the escalating tension that had existed between the couple for months, even years. The shocking truth began to emerge: Bobby's had not been the victim of a home invasion. He had been the perpetrator of the crime, the man who had killed his wife. The story of intruders was a lie, a cover-up, a desperate attempt to hide the truth. Bobby's had orchestrated the entire scene, framing the situation in a way that would make him appear as the victim of a violent crime. But the truth was much darker. The police's investigation uncovered that Bobby's had killed Caroline in cold blood. His motive was rooted in control, jealousy, and a sense of entitlement. His actions that night had been the culmination of a toxic relationship built on manipulation and fear. Caroline had tried to escape, to break free from the emotional grip he held over her, but in the end, she had become another victim of the very man who had promised to love and protect her. The tragedy of May 11, 2021, was not just the murder of a young woman, but the unraveling of a life built on lies, control, and deception. Caroline had been trapped in a nightmare that she couldn't escape, and her death was the tragic end to a story that should have been filled with love, not violence. And in the quiet of that night, as Lydia cried in her crib, the real horror of what had occurred began to sink in, the tragedy that would forever change the course of their lives. In the hours following the tragedy, Bobby's version of events gained widespread attention. His face, gaunt and pale, appeared on television screens across Greece as he tearfully recounted the harrowing ordeal he claimed to have survived. His eyes, red-rimmed from what seemed like genuine sorrow, told the story of a man left broken by the brutal loss of his wife. His voice, shaking with emotion, painted a picture of a helpless victim who had been overpowered by violent intruders. The nation watched, sympathizing with his pain, as the grieving husband struggled to process the horrifying events he had just witnessed. But as the police began to piece together the evidence at the crime scene, cracks in Bobby's story began to form. The scene, once believed to be the aftermath of a violent robbery gone wrong, started to raise questions. There were inconsistencies, details that didn't align with the theory of a home invasion. The first red flag came when investigators started analyzing Caroline's smartwatch, a device that had been recording her vital signs throughout the night. According to the data, Caroline's heart had stopped long before Bobby's had made the emergency call. The timing was crucial. Bobby's had claimed that he had been tied up during the attack, unable to move or intervene as the intruders allegedly murdered Caroline. Yet, the smartwatch data painted a different picture. Caroline's death had occurred hours before Bobby's frantic call for help. She had already been dead by the time he supposedly freed himself from his restraints and called the authorities. The smartwatch data raised suspicions, but it was the phone records that really started to unravel Bobby's story. Investigators dug into his phone's location history, trying to trace his movements during the critical hours of the night. According to Bobby's account, he had been tied up in the bedroom, unable to move as the attackers ransacked the house and murdered Caroline. But the phone's data told a different story. It showed that Bobby's had moved around the house multiple times while he claimed to be immobilized. The GPS data revealed that Bobby's had been in and out of the bedroom, moving through the house freely. At one point, he had even gone outside for a brief period, an action that contradicted the narrative of being bound and helpless. This was a major turning point in the investigation. The evidence from his phone and Caroline's smartwatch painted a damning picture. It was becoming increasingly clear that the story Bobby's had told the police and the public simply didn't add up. As the investigators delved deeper into Bobby's life, they began to uncover more inconsistencies. Interviews with neighbors and friends revealed that Bobby's had been acting strangely in the days leading up to the tragedy. Several neighbors reported hearing arguments between him and Caroline, some of which were heated enough to be audible through the walls of their home. These accounts contradicted the image Bobby's had portrayed of a perfect, loving marriage. Behind closed doors, the couple's relationship had been far from the fairy tale it appeared to be on social media. The investigation took another surprising turn when police discovered the contents of Caroline's diary. Her private writings provided a stark contrast to the picture Bobby's had painted of their life together. The diary entries revealed her growing fear of Bobby's controlling behavior, her isolation, and the emotional manipulation she had endured. She had written about the suffocating nature of their relationship, about her longing for freedom, and her desire to break away from the man who had once seemed like her soulmate. The diary painted a picture of a woman trapped in a toxic relationship, and it gave the investigators a clearer motive. Bobby's, it seemed, had been unable to accept that Caroline might want to leave him. She had tried to assert her independence, to carve out a life beyond the control he exerted over her. But Bobby's had responded with increasing jealousy and anger, unwilling to let go of the woman he saw as his possession. It soon became apparent that the murder was not the result of a random attack but the culmination of years of emotional abuse and manipulation. Bobby's jealousy and possessiveness had reached a breaking point, and the murder was a final, brutal attempt to regain control. He had staged the crime scene to look like a home invasion, hoping to throw the police off his trail. But the evidence, from Caroline's smartwatch to his own phone's movements, told a completely different story. The more the investigators uncovered, the clearer it became that Bobby's had orchestrated the entire scenario. The seemingly perfect husband had turned out to be the orchestrator of his wife's death, and his carefully constructed web of lies was beginning to unravel. His actions, his manipulation, and the way he tried to manipulate the investigation made it clear that he had not been a victim but the perpetrator. As the investigation continued, Bobby's demeanor began to shift. The calm, composed man who had once appeared on television pleading for help was no longer so convincing. His story was falling apart, and with it, the sympathy he had initially garnered from the public began to wane. The cracks in his story were too wide to ignore. The police, once willing to entertain the possibility of an intruder, were now focusing all their efforts on him. The mounting evidence, from the smartwatch data to the phone records, eventually led to Bobby's arrest. He was charged with the murder of Caroline Crouch, and the case that had captivated the nation took a dark turn. The story of the loving husband turned grieving widower was revealed to be nothing more than a carefully crafted lie, designed to mask the truth. For Caroline, there would be no justice in the way most people imagine. Her life was taken too soon, not by a stranger, but by the very person who had sworn to love and protect her. And for her young daughter, Lydia, the world she had once known was shattered in an instant. The tragedy of Caroline's death was not just a personal loss but a reminder of the darkness that can hide behind even the most charming facades. As the investigation reached its conclusion, the true horror of what had transpired became clear. Caroline had been a victim not just of violence, but of a long and painful emotional ordeal. The cracks in Bobby's story had exposed the truth: his love had never been real. What had seemed like a perfect life was, in fact, a prison. And in the end, Caroline paid the ultimate price for trying to escape. As the days passed, the weight of the evidence became too much for Bobby's to deny. His story, once filled with desperate cries for help and sorrow, had been slowly dismantled by the relentless work of investigators. The smartwatch data, the phone records, and the inconsistencies in his behavior were all pointing toward one horrifying conclusion: Bobby's was not the victim of a violent home invasion. He was the perpetrator of a cold-blooded murder. In the face of mounting pressure, Bobby's demeanor began to shift. The calm, composed exterior he had carefully cultivated in the aftermath of the crime cracked under the weight of his own lies. The media, once sympathetic to his apparent grief, now began to question his every word. The public's sympathy evaporated as the cracks in his story widened. On the 18th day of the investigation, after nearly 2 weeks of interrogation and mounting evidence, Bobby's finally broke. His confession came not with tears or remorse, but with a quiet, cold acknowledgement of the truth. Sitting in a sterile interrogation room, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, Bobby's admitted what investigators had long suspected. His voice was calm, almost detached, as he recounted the events that led to Caroline's death. He confessed that Caroline had made the decision to leave him. She had been unhappy for some time, trapped in a marriage that had become a prison. She had told him that she wanted to live a life of freedom, one that didn't include him, one where she could escape his control. The words sent Bobby's into a panic. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her, not just as a partner, but as the mother of his child. The idea that she might walk away from their life together, taking their daughter with her, was more than he could handle. In his mind, losing Caroline was not an option. The thought of her finding happiness without him, the thought of her raising their child without him by her side, consumed him with rage and desperation. In that moment, his love for her twisted into something darker: possession, control, fear of abandonment. It was these emotions, distorted and magnified by his ego and insecurity, that led to the horrifying act that would end Caroline's life. Bobby's described, almost mechanically, how he strangled Caroline. The act, he explained, was not impulsive but calculated. He had done it in their shared bedroom, the place that should have been a sanctuary for their family. The method was deliberate. He used a piece of cloth to choke her, cutting off her air supply as she struggled against him. He said she fought back, but the rage and fear driving him were too strong. Caroline, the woman he had once loved, was now just another obstacle standing in the way of his control. Once she was dead, Bobby's didn't panic. He didn't show any sign of remorse. Instead, he methodically went about staging the crime scene to make it appear as if intruders had been responsible. He ransacked the house, throwing furniture around, creating a sense of chaos and disorder. He killed their family dog, a cruel act that would help sell the idea of an attack by strangers. The dog, which had been a source of comfort to Caroline, was now another casualty in Bobby's twisted plan. The final step in his plot was to tie himself up. He had carefully thought this part through, knowing that the authorities would find it suspicious if he was unharmed. Tying himself up was a calculated move, designed to create the illusion that he had been a victim as well. After securing his own limbs, he called the police, his voice trembling with fear as he reported the supposed break-in and murder. As Bobby sat in the interrogation room, recounting his actions in a disturbingly calm manner, the weight of his confession became clear. This wasn't the act of a man driven by blind rage in the heat of a moment. This was a cold, premeditated act of murder. Bobby's had planned every step of the crime, carefully orchestrating each detail to make it appear as though he had been a helpless victim. But in the end, it was his own lies, his own actions, that exposed the truth. The revelation of Bobby's confession sent shockwaves through Greece. The nation that had once rallied behind him, the grieving husband, now saw him for what he truly was, a calculated murderer who had taken the life of the woman he claimed to love. The public's sympathy evaporated, replaced by a deep sense of betrayal and disbelief. How could the man who had been so charming, so convincing, have been capable of such a heinous crime? For Caroline's family and friends, the confession was a devastating blow. They had always known something was off about Bobby's, but they had never imagined he was capable of taking Caroline's life. They had seen the signs of his controlling behavior, the cracks in the facade of their perfect marriage, but they had never believed it would come to this. The shock of the confession was compounded by the knowledge that Caroline had been trapped in a relationship that had grown more and more toxic over time. In the days that followed, more details of Bobby's confession came to light. He spoke of his increasing jealousy and paranoia in the months leading up to Caroline's death. He had monitored her every move, controlled her interactions with friends and family, and manipulated her into staying in a marriage that she no longer wanted. The confession revealed just how deep the emotional abuse had gone, how Bobby's need for control had gradually suffocated Caroline's spirit. But even as the full scope of his actions became clear, Bobby's showed no signs of genuine remorse. His words were devoid of any real emotion, as though he had been recounting the events of someone else's life, not his own. The confession was nothing more than an admission of guilt, a way for him to avoid further interrogation and to protect himself from the consequences of his crime. For Caroline's memory, the confession was a bitter pill to swallow. She had been more than just a victim, she had been a woman who had dreams, hopes, and a family. Her tragic death was a result of a toxic relationship that had slowly eroded her sense of self. The confession, while it brought some sense of closure, did nothing to bring her back or undo the damage that had been done. As Bobby's trial approached, the nation remained in shock, struggling to come to terms with the reality of the crime. The grieving husband who had once seemed so genuine was now exposed as a man who had murdered the woman he had once promised to love and cherish. And for Caroline, there would be no justice in the way most people imagined. Her life had been taken by the very person who should have been her protector, and the world she had known was lost forever. In the wake of Bobby's confession, the public's reaction was one of shock, disbelief, and anger. The image of a grieving husband, devastated by the loss of his wife, had been shattered, and in its place stood the truth of a calculated murderer. Bobby's carefully crafted persona as a loving and devoted husband had been an illusion, and now the world saw him for what he truly was, a man who had betrayed the very person he was supposed to protect. The outrage that followed was swift and widespread. People across Greece, and even around the world, felt deceived by the image of perfection Bobby's had so meticulously constructed. His public displays of affection, the pictures of their seemingly idyllic life, the romantic gestures, all of it had been a facade, designed to hide the truth of his controlling and manipulative behavior. Caroline's death became a symbol of the silent struggles that so often go unnoticed in relationships that appear perfect on the surface. The tragedy of Caroline's death sparked widespread conversations about domestic abuse and the hidden dangers that can lurk within even the most seemingly picture-perfect marriages. For many, Caroline's story opened their eyes to the reality of emotional and psychological abuse, which can be just as damaging as physical violence. It was a wake-up call for those who had believed that a happy marriage could only be defined by outward appearances, by the photos shared on social media and the smiles plastered on faces in public. Behind closed doors, Caroline had been living a life of isolation, fear, and control. Her story became a rallying cry for those who had suffered in silence, and for those who had witnessed the warning signs but hadn't known how to help. People began to reflect on what they hadn't seen: the signs of her pain, the subtle ways in which Bobby's had manipulated and controlled her. Friends, family, and even neighbors who had seen Caroline smile now looked back with regret, wondering if they could have done more to intervene, to offer support, or to ask the right questions. In the months that followed, the case continued to dominate headlines, and the conversation around domestic abuse grew louder. Support groups, advocacy organizations, and legal experts came forward to highlight the importance of recognizing the warning signs of domestic violence. Caroline's death, though tragic, became a catalyst for change, inspiring action, and raising awareness in ways that had been impossible before. More people began to speak out about their own experiences, and the silence that had surrounded the issue of domestic abuse began to break. Caroline's story was not just about a woman whose life had been cut short by the man she loved, it was about the countless others who were living in fear, in isolation, and in silence. It was a reminder that abuse doesn't always look like what we expect. It doesn't always leave visible scars. The emotional manipulation, the control, the subtle threats and intimidation, these things can be just as dangerous, and just as deadly, as physical violence. As the public outcry grew, so did the call for more resources and support for victims of domestic violence. The tragedy of Caroline Crouch's death served as a stark reminder that those who are suffering often do so in isolation, without the help or support they need. The importance of early intervention, of listening to those who may be afraid to speak, became more apparent than ever before. And with that, the conversation about how to recognize the signs of abuse and offer support to those who need it reached a new level. The case of Caroline's murder was a painful one, but it also sparked a broader societal shift. It was a call to action, one that demanded attention, resources, and, most importantly, compassion. People who had once been unaware of the signs of domestic violence were now paying attention. Those who had once been too scared to speak out were finding their voices, encouraged by the collective support and strength of others who had gone through similar experiences. For Caroline, the battle was over. She had lost her life to a man who had vowed to love and protect her, a man who had twisted that promise into something dark and deadly. Her story had come to a tragic end, but the impact of her life and her death was far from over. Her story would continue to inspire those who were suffering in silence to seek help, to reach out, and to know that they were not alone. As the video concludes, a message of hope and action remains. It serves as a reminder that, while we cannot change the past, we can work to prevent future tragedies. Caroline Crouch's life and death are a poignant call to end domestic violence, to recognize the signs of abuse, and to offer support to those who need it most. The message is clear: no one should have to suffer in silence, and no one should have to endure the kind of pain Caroline endured. Caroline's story may have ended in tragedy, but her legacy will live on through the changes it sparked in the way society understands and responds to domestic violence. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this video. Your engagement helps us bring awareness to important issues like this one and allows us to continue telling stories that matter. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more true crime stories and deep dives into real-life mysteries. Your support means the world to us. Thank you for watching, and remember, always stay aware, always stay compassionate.